The hand came down before anyone in the room understood what was happening. Commander Voraz Kel struck the human diplomat across the face, hard enough to snap his head to one side, hard enough that the sound of it echoed through the chamber and out across a live signal being watched by more than 1,000 worlds. For one heartbeat, nobody moved. Marcus Alaric stood in the center of the negotiation floor, his cheek burning, his eyes still closed from the impact. Around him, alien officials from a dozen empires sat frozen in their seats, their translators still humming quietly, still waiting to convert whatever came next into 100 different languages. Commander Voraz straightened to his full height, nearly 7 feet of gray armored muscle, and looked down at the human with open contempt. To him, this was simple. Humans were new. Humans were untested. Humans had walked into the largest diplomatic gathering the galaxy had ever hosted and dared to question his authority in front of cameras meant to show every watching species exactly how strong the Kryvex dominion was. He had not expected an apology. He had wanted a lesson. He got the opposite. Marcus opened his eyes. There was no fear in them, no shock, no confusion, just a strange, quiet stillness. The kind of stillness that comes only to people who have already decided, long before this moment, exactly what they will do if someone crosses a certain line. The chamber had been built for peace talks. Neutral ground, chosen by the Threnai Accord, a coalition of older species trying to bring the galaxy's newest and strangest arrival, humanity, into the wider community of stars. Every major power had sent someone. Every camera in the room fed directly into a broadcast net, reaching more systems than most species could count. It was supposed to be humanity's introduction to the galaxy. Instead, it became something else entirely. Voraz turned back toward his own delegation, already speaking in his own language, already dismissing the human as beneath further attention. He believed the moment was over. He believed he had made his point. He was wrong. Marcus took one step forward, unhurried, almost casual, and reached out. 5 seconds later, everything the galaxy believed about humanity would change forever. But to understand why a diplomat, a man sent specifically to talk and not to fight, was able to do what happened next, you have to understand who Marcus Alaric actually was before he ever put on a formal suit and sat down at a negotiation table. He had not always been called a diplomat. For 9 years, before any alien ship had ever entered Earth's solar system, Marcus served in a unit that did not officially exist. No records, no medals, no press releases. His government sent him to places where quiet, careful, controlled violence solved problems that politicians could never solve out loud. He was trained not just to fight, but to read a room, to measure intention in the space of a breath, to know exactly how much force a situation required, and deliver precisely that much, nothing more. When humanity made first contact, and the wider galaxy demanded a diplomatic presence, Earth's leaders faced an unusual problem. They needed someone calm enough to sit across from beings who could crush a city with a single ship, someone who would not panic, someone who understood that words mattered more than weapons. But they also wanted someone who understood exactly what would happen if those words failed. Marcus was chosen not, despite his old life, but because of it. He was retired from that world. He had built a new one, quieter, slower, built around long mornings and calm conversations. He believed those years were behind him. The Kryvex commander did not know any of this. He looked at Marcus and saw the same thing his scans told him: soft tissue, minimal muscle density compared to his own species, a lifespan barely a fraction of a Kryvex warrior's. Weak, short-lived, beneath consideration. The Kryvex dominion had earned its reputation through centuries of conquest. They did not negotiate as equals. They negotiated as rulers speaking to subjects, and they had never once been forced to reconsider that approach, because no species had ever given them a reason to. Until today. The insult that led to the strike had actually started small, almost embarrassingly small. A translation error, a slight delay in Marcus rising when Voraz entered the chamber, a gesture the Kryvex read as defiance where none had been intended. In another circumstance, it might have been resolved with an apology and a laugh. But Voraz Kel was not interested in resolving it quietly. He wanted every watching species to see a human corrected in public, wanted the galaxy to understand that no matter how humanity presented itself, it would always answer to older, stronger powers. So he struck. He expected silence. He expected fear. He expected the same reaction he had received 1,000 times before from beings who understood, instinctively, that resistance against a Kryvex commander ended badly for the one resisting. Instead, he got stillness of a different kind. Marcus did not raise his voice. He did not call for security. He did not look toward the human delegation seated behind him for support. He simply straightened, rolled his shoulders once, the way a man might loosen up before doing something physical, and looked at Voraz with an expression that had nothing to do with anger. It looked almost like patience. Almost like disappointment. The Threnii officials monitoring the chamber exchanged uncertain glances. Something about the human's posture had shifted, subtle but unmistakable, the way a predator's stance changes just before it moves, so quiet that only those trained to notice would catch it at all. Voraz did not notice. He had already turned his attention away, already speaking to his aide in low, dismissive tones, already treating the moment as finished. That was his mistake. Marcus stepped forward. The commander's personal blade, a ceremonial weapon each Kryvex officer wore openly as a symbol of rank and authority, hung from his side, its hilt catching the light of the chamber. It was meant to be seen. It was meant to remind everyone in the room exactly who held power here. Nobody expected it to be reached for by anyone other than its owner. The distance between Marcus and Voraz had never been more than a few steps, close enough for conversation, close enough that neither the Kryvex guards nor the automated security systems considered it a threat. Diplomatic protocol required proximity. Protocol did not anticipate what proximity would allow. Marcus's hand moved. It was not fast in the way explosions are fast, not loud, not dramatic. It was efficient, controlled, the kind of motion built from thousands of hours of training so long ago that it no longer required thought, only intention. Voraz felt the shift in the air before he understood what caused it. He turned back, already annoyed, already prepared to dismiss whatever the human intended to say next. He did not get the chance. The chamber's cameras, still broadcasting live to every corner of known space, captured every fraction of a second that followed. Later, those seconds would be studied, replayed, translated into dozens of languages, dissected by military analysts on 100 worlds who had never before needed to consider humanity as anything more than a curious new arrival. But in that moment, none of the officials in the room understood any of that yet. They only understood that something had changed, that the room had tilted from routine diplomatic ceremony into something none of them had names for. Marcus Alaric had spent years building a quiet life, specifically so he would never need to use what he used to be. Voraz Kel had spent his entire career being certain that no one would ever make him regret underestimating them. Both of those things were about to end. The room held its breath, and the countdown had already begun. The chamber's lights hummed at a frequency most species in the room could not hear, but Marcus could feel it, low and steady, almost like a heartbeat beneath the floor. In the strange stretch of time that followed the strike, that hum was the only thing that felt normal. Everything else had changed. 1 second had passed since Voraz turned back to face him. Marcus's mind, trained long before diplomacy had ever entered his life, was already working faster than conscious thought. It was not anger driving him. Anger was loud, messy, unpredictable. What moved through him now was something quieter and far more dangerous. Assessment. Distance to target, less than a meter. Weapon available, the blade at the commander's hip, unguarded, worn more as symbol than as tool. Exactly the kind of oversight that came from centuries of never being challenged. Guards, two Kryvex soldiers stationed near the chamber's outer wall, both still reacting to the sound of the strike rather than anticipating what came next. Their reflexes, while strong, were built around expecting threats from a distance, from weapons, from obvious aggression. They were not built around expecting a diplomat to move. 2 seconds. Voraz's expression had not yet caught up to the moment. He still wore the same look of dismissive irritation he'd worn when he turned away, the look of a commander who believed the matter was already settled. His species had built an empire on the assumption that fear, once instilled, stayed instilled. He was not looking for resistance because resistance had never come from someone he had already struck. Marcus's body moved before that assumption could correct itself. There is a kind of stillness trained into people who have done dangerous work for a long time, a stillness that looks like calm but is actually total readiness. Marcus had lived inside that stillness for years, on rooftops overlooking cities whose names were never printed in any newspaper, in rooms where a single mistake meant people did not go home. He had believed that version of himself was retired. It was not gone. It had only been waiting. 3 seconds. His hand closed around the hilt of the ceremonial blade before Voraz even realized the weapon had left its place at his side. The motion was economical. No wasted energy, no dramatic flourish, the kind of movement built from thousands of hours of repetition until it required no thought at all, only permission. Around the chamber, translators continued their soft mechanical hum, still converting the ambassador's earlier remarks into other tongues, technology unaware that the moment it was translating had already become irrelevant. The two Kryvex guards began to move, weapons rising, but their bodies were built for strength, not speed, evolved on a world where raw power had always been enough to end confrontations before they truly began. They had never needed to be fast. Marcus had spent 9 years of his life becoming exactly that. 4 seconds. Voraz's eyes widened, the first flicker of understanding crossing his face, the first moment his mind registered that something was wrong, that the human in front of him was not simply standing there, that his stance had shifted, that something in his hand caught the light. It was already too late to matter. The Threnai officials seated closest to the platform would later describe what happened next, not as violence, but as inevitability, the sense that once the first second had passed, once the human had made his decision, nothing in the room could have changed what followed. Not the guards, not the distance, not even Voraz's own considerable strength. Some outcomes, once set in motion, simply complete themselves. 5 seconds. The broadcast feed, still live, still reaching every monitoring station across 1,000 worlds, captured the final motion with perfect clarity. The kind of clarity that would be replayed endlessly in the hours and days that followed, studied frame by species who had never needed to study a human being so closely before. It was over before most of the room understood it had truly begun. Marcus stepped back, calm, breathing steady, his expression unchanged from the moment he had first opened his eyes after the strike. There was no triumph on his face, no satisfaction. Only the same quiet stillness that had been there from the very beginning, the stillness of someone who had done exactly what he intended to do, no more and no less. The blade lowered to his side. For a long moment, nobody in the chamber spoke. Nobody moved. The hum of the translators continued uselessly into the silence, waiting for words that were not coming. Ambassador Laura Bennett, seated among the human delegation at the back of the room, had not moved since the strike landed. She had trained for years to understand alien customs, to anticipate diplomatic friction, to prepare for 1,000 possible complications. Nothing in her preparation had accounted for this. She had known, in a distant, official way, that Marcus's file contained sections she was not cleared to read. She had assumed those sections belonged to a past that no longer mattered. She understood now that some pasts do not simply disappear, they wait. Beside her, a young aide named Ethan Hale sat frozen, his tablet still recording, his hands trembling slightly as the reality of what he had just witnessed settled into him. He had joined the diplomatic corps because he believed in the mission of peaceful contact, believed humanity's first steps into the galaxy should be defined by cooperation, not conflict. He would spend a long time afterward wondering what this moment meant for that belief. Across the chamber, the remaining Kryvex officials stood in stunned silence, their carefully maintained composure fractured for the first time in living memory. Their commander, a symbol of Kryvex strength, broadcast to 1,000 worlds specifically to demonstrate dominance, was gone in the span of 5 seconds, at the hands of a species they had assessed as harmless. The 2 guards who had tried to react stood frozen near the chamber's edge, weapons still raised, uncertain what to do with a threat that no longer existed, and a diplomat who showed no sign of further aggression, only that same unsettling calm. Marcus turned toward them slowly, his hands open, empty, non-threatening, the blade set down on the floor in front of him with deliberate care, a gesture meant to communicate exactly one thing: this is finished, and I am not seeking further conflict. The guards did not fire. Some instinct, buried beneath training built for a different kind of galaxy, told them that whatever had just happened was not the beginning of a battle. It was the end of one. Somewhere far above the chamber, in orbit around the neutral station, monitoring officers from a dozen different species stared at their screens in silence, watching the same 5 seconds loop again in their minds, even as the feed continued live. They had tuned in, expecting a demonstration of Kryvex superiority. They had witnessed something else entirely, something none of them had context for, something that would take days, weeks, months to fully understand. Marcus stood quietly at the center of the chamber, waiting, not for applause, not for judgment, simply waiting to see what the galaxy would do next with the truth it had just been shown. For the first time since humanity had entered the wider community of stars, an entire chamber full of alien officials looked at a single unarmed man and understood, without needing a single word of translation, that they had been wrong about something very important. The 5 seconds were over. What came after would last far longer. The image froze, on 1,000 different screens, at almost the same instant. The final frame of the broadcast burned into the memory of every species watching, the moment the ceremonial blade completed its motion and the chamber fell into absolute silence. Then the silence broke, not in one place, but everywhere at once. On the home world of the Threnaya, the species who had organized the neutral talks in the first place, entire broadcast centers erupted into confused shouting as analysts tried to make sense of footage none of them had prepared for. Diplomatic feeds were supposed to show slow, careful negotiation, not the sudden and complete collapse of a Kryvex commander's authority in front of the galaxy. On Kryvex Dominion worlds, the reaction was very different. Shock gave way quickly to anger, then to something closer to disbelief, as citizens who had grown up believing their species stood at the top of the galaxy's hierarchy watched that belief shatter in real time. Military channels lit up with demands for immediate retaliation. Political channels filled with confusion about how such a thing could even be possible. On 100 smaller worlds, worlds that had lived for generations under the shadow of Kryvex expansion, worlds that had learned to keep their objections quiet because objecting openly to the Dominion had never ended well, the reaction was quieter, more careful, but unmistakable. In private communications, in encrypted messages between old allies who had shared grievances against Kryvex rule for decades, a single question began repeating itself. What exactly are these humans? Ambassador Celadoran, representing a coalition of smaller frontier worlds that had suffered under Kryvex pressure for generations, watched the replay in her private quarters with an expression she made sure nobody else could see. She had spent 30 years learning to keep her opinions hidden behind careful diplomatic language. Tonight, for the first time in longer than she could remember, she allowed herself something close to hope. She said nothing publicly, not yet. But she made a note to reach out to the human delegation through unofficial channels, quietly, carefully, the way old grievances often found new allies. Meanwhile, in the chamber itself, the aftermath was far less dramatic than anyone watching from a distance might have expected. There was no cheering, no triumphant declaration. Marcus Alaric stood exactly where he had been standing, hands still open, posture still calm, while Threnai security officials slowly approached, uncertain how to proceed in a situation none of their protocols had ever anticipated. Ambassador Laura Bennett rose from her seat at last, her legs unsteady beneath her, and walked toward the center of the chamber. She had spent years building relationships across dozens of species, learning the careful language of compromise, believing that words alone could carry humanity safely into its new place among the stars. She reached Marcus's side and studied his face for a long moment, searching for something: anger, fear, regret. She found none of it, only that same quiet stillness that had been there since the moment the strike landed. "Are you all right?" she asked quietly, her voice barely above a whisper. Marcus nodded once. "I'm fine. You understand what you just did?" "I understand exactly what I did," he said, his tone calm, almost gentle. "He struck first. I finished it." Laura studied him a moment longer, then turned to look at the remaining Kryvex delegation, still frozen in stunned silence near the far end of the chamber. She had spent her entire career trying to prevent exactly this kind of moment, and yet some part of her, some quiet part she rarely allowed herself to acknowledge, understood that this moment might accomplish something years of careful negotiation never could. Respect, whether earned through admiration or through fear, was still respect. Back on Earth, in a secure briefing room far beneath the surface of a city that never appeared on any tourist map, General Daniel Cross watched the same footage on a wall-sized screen, surrounded by a small group of senior officials who had been read into the details of Marcus Alaric's file long before any diplomat was ever chosen for the mission. Nobody in the room looked surprised. "He held back," Daniel said quietly, almost to himself, as the footage looped for the third time. "That wasn't even close to everything he's capable of." Beside him, a younger analyst named Grace Miller frowned. "The rest of the galaxy doesn't know that." "No," Daniel said. "They don't, and that's exactly the point." He had been part of the small committee responsible for selecting Marcus for the diplomatic post, a decision that had been debated fiercely behind closed doors for months. Some had argued that sending a man with his particular background into a purely diplomatic role was reckless, that it invited exactly this kind of outcome. Others had argued the opposite, that humanity's first true test on the galactic stage needed someone who could speak calmly and diplomatically for as long as possible, but who would not hesitate for even a second if that calm approach was ever violently rejected. Tonight had proven which argument was correct. Daniel allowed himself a small, tired smile. "Every species out there just learned something about us, that we've known about ourselves for a very long time." "And what's that?" Grace asked. "That we don't start conflicts," he said, "but we absolutely know how to finish them." Across the galaxy, the footage continued to spread, copied, translated, analyzed, shared between species who had never before had reason to study humanity so closely. Military strategists on a dozen worlds pulled up whatever limited data existed on human physiology and history, searching for patterns, searching for explanations, searching for anything that might help them understand what they had just witnessed. They found very little. Humanity's public historical records, freely available to any species curious enough to look, were filled with centuries of conflict, invention, cooperation, and survival against odds that would have ended most other developing civilizations. But nothing in those records fully explained the calm, controlled efficiency of what had just happened in that chamber, live, on camera, in front of the entire galaxy. That absence of explanation troubled some species far more than any amount of information could have. On a heavily fortified command world deep within Kryvek's territory, senior officials gathered in emergency session, their usual confidence replaced by something none of them were used to feeling: uncertainty. Commander Voraz Kel had been one of their most decorated officers, a symbol of Kryvek's strength sent specifically to demonstrate dominance to the wider galaxy. His loss, broadcast live to every watching world, was not just a personal tragedy for his family and command staff. It was a wound to the very foundation of Kryvek's identity, an identity built entirely around the belief that no species could challenge their authority and survive the attempt. High Overseer Malric Van, the most senior Kryvek's official present, stared at the frozen final frame of the broadcast for a long time before finally speaking. "This changes everything," he said quietly. One of his advisors, a younger officer eager to prove himself, immediately began outlining retaliation options: fleet movements, punitive strikes, a full military response designed to restore Kryvek's honor through overwhelming force. Malric raised a hand, silencing him before he could finish. "You didn't watch the footage carefully enough," he said. "That man did not attack Voraz. Voraz attacked him, in full view of the entire galaxy, unprovoked, without cause, beyond wounded pride, and the human ended it in 5 seconds, without hesitation, without fear, and without a single word of threat before or after." He paused, letting the weight of his own words settle over the room. "If that is what one unarmed diplomat can do in 5 seconds, he continued, I do not want to imagine what an entire species like that could do if we gave them a real reason to respond." The room fell into uneasy silence. For the first time in generations, the Kryvek's dominion, an empire that had expanded across dozens of star systems through the simple and consistent application of overwhelming force, found itself facing a species it did not know how to threaten. Meanwhile, back on the neutral station, Marcus Alaric sat quietly in a private room set aside for him following the incident, waiting for the inevitable questions that would come from every direction, human and alien alike. Ambassador Laura Bennett had stepped out briefly to coordinate with Earth's leadership, leaving him alone for a few rare minutes of stillness. He looked down at his hands, steady, unshaking, and allowed himself, just for a moment, to feel the weight of what had happened settle over him. Not guilt, not regret, something closer to quiet acceptance. He had built a life specifically to avoid needing the skills that had just been broadcast to the entire galaxy. He had believed, or at least hoped, that those skills belonged to a version of himself that no longer needed to exist. Tonight had proven otherwise. The door opened quietly, and Ethan Hale, the young aide who had watched everything unfold from the back of the chamber, stepped inside, still visibly shaken but steadier than before. "They're asking for a statement," Ethan said. "From you specifically. Every major network across 1,000 systems wants to hear directly from the man who did this." Marcus was quiet for a long moment before answering. "Tell them the truth," he said finally. "Tell them I didn't want any of this to happen. Tell them humanity came here hoping for peace, and we still hope for it." He paused, his eyes distant for a moment, before continuing. "But make sure they understand something else too. Peace with us was never something anyone else was owed automatically. It was always a choice. Commander Voraz made his choice tonight, and it cost him everything." Ethan nodded slowly, absorbing the weight of those words, understanding that whatever statement eventually reached the galaxy, it would define humanity's reputation for generations to come. Outside the station, ships from a dozen different empires continued monitoring the situation, waiting anxiously to see what would happen next, whether the Kryvek's dominion would respond with retaliation, whether humanity would face consequences for what had happened, whether the fragile framework of galactic diplomacy that had only just begun to include Earth would survive its first real test. Nobody yet knew the answer. But across 1,000 worlds, one truth had already settled into the collective consciousness of every watching species. a truth that would shape how the galaxy viewed humanity from this moment forward. They had come expecting to meet a new, curious, relatively harmless addition to the galactic community. Instead, they had learned, in the span of 5 unforgettable seconds, that humanity was something far more complicated, far more capable, and far more worthy of careful respect than anyone had previously imagined. The galaxy would spend the following weeks trying to decide exactly what to do with that knowledge. 3 days after the incident, Kryvex warships began gathering near the edge of neutral territory, their formation deliberate, unmistakable, a clear signal that the Dominion had not yet decided whether words alone would settle what had happened in that chamber. Ambassador Laura Bennett received the report early in the morning, station time, and immediately requested an emergency session with the full Threnai Accord. She had spent her entire career trying to avoid exactly this kind of escalation, and now she found herself standing at the center of it, representing a species the rest of the galaxy suddenly regarded with equal parts curiosity and caution. The session convened within hours. Representatives from a dozen major species filled the chamber, though this time security had been increased considerably, and the ceremonial ornamentation that once decorated the platform had been replaced with something more practical. High Overseer Malric Van appeared through a secure holographic connection rather than in person, a decision that told its own story. Despite the visible show of military strength near the border, he had chosen caution over confrontation, at least for the moment. "We are here to discuss consequences," Malric began, his tone measured but tense. "A Kryvex commander is dead, broadcast to the entire galaxy, by a member of a species we had classified as non-threatening." Laura rose to respond, her voice steady, despite the pressure of 1,000 watching worlds. Commander Vaforaz Kell struck an unarmed diplomat without provocation, in violation of the very neutrality agreement this chamber was built to protect. Every recording confirms this. The response that followed was not an act of aggression, it was self-defense, carried out with restraint. A murmur rippled through the gathered delegations. Restraint was not the word many of them would have chosen after watching those 5 seconds play out, but the more they studied the footage, replayed endlessly across 1,000 channels, the more they began to notice details they had missed on first viewing. Marcus had not pursued Voraz's guards. He had not escalated beyond the single necessary action. He had lowered the blade immediately afterward and made no further move toward violence, despite having every opportunity to do so against 2 armed but stunned soldiers. Restraint, it turned out, was exactly the right word, once you understood what restraint from someone like Marcus Alaric actually looked like. Malric was quiet for a long moment, clearly weighing options that had no comfortable answer. Retaliation risked confirming, publicly and permanently, that humanity was capable of ending a confrontation instantly and without mercy if pushed, a reputation the Dominion desperately did not want spreading further. Silence risked appearing weak in front of every species that had ever resented Kryvex dominance. "The footage will be reviewed," Malric said finally, choosing the careful, non-committal language of a leader buying time. "Formal proceedings will determine responsibility." It was not an apology. It was not a declaration of war either. It was, Laura understood immediately, an admission that the Dominion no longer knew which choice was safer. In the days that followed, that uncertainty spread outward across the galaxy like ripples from a stone dropped into still water. Species who had quietly resented Kryvex expansion for generations began reaching out to the human delegation, cautiously at first, testing whether an alliance with this newly revealed power might finally offer them the protection they had lacked for so long. Ambassador Sella Doran was among the first to make contact through official channels, requesting a private meeting with Laura Bennett aboard a small transport ship registered to a minor frontier world. The meeting, when it finally happened, was brief but significant. "My people have lived under threat of Kryvex expansion for 3 generations, Sella said quietly, once the 2 of them were alone. "We have watched allies conquered, resources seized, protests silenced. We had accepted that this was simply how the galaxy worked. She paused, studying Laura carefully. Then we watched your diplomat end a Kryvex commander's life in 5 seconds, without hesitation and without fear of consequences. For the first time, in longer than I can remember, my people are asking a different question. What question? Laura asked. Whether there might finally be a power in this galaxy willing to stand against the Dominion, Sela said. Whether that power might be you. Laura chose her words carefully, aware that anything she said now would carry enormous weight. Humanity did not come here seeking conflict with anyone. We came hoping to build peaceful relationships across the galaxy. I understand that, Sela said, but peaceful intentions and the ability to defend those intentions are not the same thing. Your species has both. That combination is rarer than you might realize. Back on Earth, General Daniel Cross found himself fielding an unusual volume of inquiries, official and unofficial, from governments and factions across dozens of star systems, each one asking careful, indirect questions about humanity's true capabilities, about how many people like Marcus Alaric existed, about what exactly humanity was capable of if provoked on a larger scale. He answered each inquiry with the same careful diplomatic language, revealing nothing specific, confirming nothing directly, allowing the uncertainty itself to do the work that direct threats never could. In a private briefing with Earth's senior leadership, Daniel spoke more candidly. They're afraid of what they don't understand, he said, and right now, they don't understand much. That uncertainty is doing more for our security than any fleet we could build. Grace Miller, seated across from him, frowned slightly. And when that uncertainty runs out, when they start actually understanding us. Daniel considered the question seriously before answering. Then we'll have already shown them exactly what happens if they choose the wrong path. We won't need to prove it twice. Meanwhile, aboard the neutral station, Marcus Alaric continued his diplomatic duties, though everything about how other species approached him had changed. Where once alien officials had regarded him with casual dismissal, they now watched him with careful, measured attention, studying his every gesture, searching for clues about what other capabilities might lie hidden beneath his calm exterior. He found the shift uncomfortable, though he understood it was inevitable. He had never wanted to be seen as a weapon. He had wanted to be seen as someone capable of building bridges between his species and the wider galaxy. During a quiet moment between official sessions, Ethan Hale approached him with a question that had clearly been weighing on him since the incident. "Do you regret it?" Ethan asked carefully. "What happened with Commander Varaz?" Marcus considered the question for a long moment before answering. "I regret that it was necessary," he said finally. "I don't regret the outcome. He made a choice. I made mine. The difference is that mine was the only one that kept this entire negotiation from collapsing into something far worse." "How do you mean?" "If I had done nothing," Marcus said, "if I had simply absorbed that strike quietly, every species watching would have learned a very different lesson about humanity. They would have learned that we could be struck, publicly, without consequence. Every ambitious commander across 1,000 worlds would have taken note. We would have spent the next century proving, over and over, that the lesson was wrong." He paused, his gaze distant. Instead, the lesson was learned once, completely, in 5 seconds, no further proof required. Ethan absorbed this in silence, understanding for the first time the strange, careful calculation that had gone into Marcus's selection for this role. A calculation built not around avoiding conflict entirely, but around ensuring any conflict that did occur ended so decisively that no repetition would ever be necessary. 3 weeks after the incident, the Kryvex Dominion issued its first official communication since the emergency session, a carefully worded statement acknowledging that Commander Varaz Kell had, according to their own internal review, violated the neutrality protocols governing the negotiation chamber. It stopped short of a full apology, but it was, by Kryvex standards, an extraordinary concession, the first time in the Dominion's recorded history that they had publicly acknowledged fault in an encounter with another species. Alongside the statement came a formal request, unusual in both its tone and its timing, for renewed negotiations with the human delegation, this time under significantly revised protocols that placed far greater emphasis on mutual respect and considerably less emphasis on demonstrations of dominance. Laura Bennett read the request twice before allowing herself a small, tired smile. "They're not apologizing because they suddenly respect us," she said to Marcus later that evening as the two of them reviewed the document together. "They're apologizing because they're afraid of what happens if they don't." "Does the reason matter?" Marcus asked. Laura considered the question seriously. "In diplomacy, sometimes it doesn't. Respect earned through fear is still respect. It's not the foundation I would have chosen to build on, but it's a foundation." Across the galaxy, other species watched the Kryvek statement with quiet fascination, understanding immediately what it represented: the first crack in an empire that had never before shown any willingness to bend. Smaller worlds that had long lived under the shadow of Kryvek's expansion found themselves recalculating their own positions, wondering whether the balance of power across known space had just shifted in ways that would take years to fully understand. Marcus Alaric, meanwhile, found himself in an unfamiliar position, no longer simply a diplomat representing humanity's interests, but something closer to a symbol, a living reminder to every watching species of exactly what humanity was capable of when peace was violated. He had never wanted that role. He understood now that he no longer had a choice in the matter. The galaxy had seen what happened in those 5 seconds. It would not forget. And humanity, for the first time since making contact with the wider community of stars, found itself no longer treated as a curiosity to be studied from a safe distance, but as a power to be carefully, respectfully, and permanently accounted for. 6 months after the incident, the neutral station hosted a very different kind of gathering, one built not around ceremony or demonstration of power, but around the quiet, practical work of drafting treaties that would shape relationships between species for generations to come. Marcus Alaric sat near the back of the chamber during most of these sessions now. His role shifted from active negotiator to something closer to advisor, a presence whose reputation alone carried weight in every room he entered. He no longer needed to speak often. The mere fact of his presence reminded everyone at the table exactly what had happened the last time someone underestimated humanity in this very chamber. The Kryvek's delegation, led now by a younger, more cautious official named Doran Yell, approached negotiations with a formality and respect that would have been unimaginable a year earlier. Doran had studied the footage of the incident extensively, not out of morbid curiosity, but as a genuine attempt to understand what had gone wrong, and how to ensure his own conduct never repeated Voraz's fatal mistake. "Ambassador Alaric," Doran said, during one particular session, using a title Marcus had never officially requested, but had somehow acquired regardless. "May I ask you something directly?" Marcus nodded. "Of course. Do you believe conflict between our species is inevitable?" Marcus considered the question carefully before answering. "I believe conflict is inevitable between any two species that fail to understand each other. It's not inevitable between species that make the effort to understand each other properly. And do you believe we've made that effort?" "I believe you're trying," Marcus said. "That's more than your predecessor ever managed." Doran accepted this without offense, understanding the truth behind it. The Kryvek's dominion had spent generations building an empire on the assumption that overwhelming strength alone was sufficient to maintain order. That assumption had been tested publicly, decisively, and permanently found wanting. Rebuilding their approach to diplomacy from that foundation required patience neither side had previously possessed. Elsewhere across the galaxy, humanity's reputation continued to evolve in ways nobody could have fully predicted in the immediate aftermath of the incident. Smaller worlds that had once viewed Earth with polite indifference now actively sought alliances, understanding that a species capable of such precise, controlled response to aggression made for a valuable ally against larger, more predatory powers. Ambassador Celadoran's coalition of frontier worlds formalized a mutual defense agreement with Earth within the year, one of several such agreements that would eventually place humanity at the center of a growing network of alliances stretching across dozens of star systems. None of these agreements were built primarily around military cooperation. Most focused on trade, shared research, cultural exchange, the ordinary business of peaceful coexistence between civilizations. But underlying every single agreement was an unspoken understanding, shared by every species that signed them, that humanity's willingness to negotiate peacefully was not born from weakness, but from genuine choice, a choice that could be withdrawn instantly and completely if that peace was ever violated. General Daniel Cross, testifying before Earth's Unified Planetary Council nearly a year after the incident, summarized the shift succinctly. "We didn't conquer anything," he told the assembled representatives. "We didn't send fleets across the galaxy demanding tribute. We sent one diplomat to one negotiation table, and he did exactly what any of us would have done if struck without cause. The galaxy drew its own conclusions from that. We simply let them." Grace Miller, now serving as a senior analyst within Earth's diplomatic corps, added her own observation during the same session. "The lesson wasn't really about violence at all," she said. "It was about restraint. Marcus had every opportunity to escalate that situation far beyond what was necessary, and he chose not to. That restraint told the galaxy more about who we are than the outcome itself ever could." Marcus Alaric himself gave few public statements in the months that followed, preferring instead to let his actions and his continued calm presence at the negotiating table speak for themselves. When journalists occasionally managed to secure brief interviews, he answered their questions with the same quiet honesty that had defined his entire diplomatic career. During one such interview, a reporter from a prominent Threnii news network asked him directly whether he viewed himself as a hero or as something closer to a weapon that had simply been pointed in the right direction at the right moment. Marcus considered the question for a long time before answering. "I view myself as someone who was given a job," he said finally. "The job was to represent my species honestly, to negotiate in good faith, and to make sure that good faith was never mistaken for an invitation to be mistreated. I did that job. Whether that makes me a hero or something else entirely, I'll leave for others to decide." The reporter pressed further, asking whether he believed similar incidents might occur again as humanity continued expanding its presence across the galaxy. "I hope not," Marcus said honestly. "Nobody wins when situations like that become necessary. But if it happens again, if someone decides that humanity's patience is an invitation rather than a choice, they should understand exactly what they're choosing to test." That interview, like the footage of the original incident, spread quickly across 1,000 worlds, studied and discussed by species who continued to find humanity endlessly fascinating precisely because so much about their behavior defied easy categorization. Here was a species capable of extraordinary violence when necessary, yet one that consistently chose patience, cooperation, and genuine partnership whenever those options remained available. That combination, more than any single act of strength, was what ultimately earned humanity its place among the galaxy's respected powers. Within Kryvek's training academies, a curious tradition began to take hold over the following years, one that would have seemed impossible before the incident ever occurred. New officers, before being granted any diplomatic assignment involving human representatives, were required to study the footage of Commander Voraz Kel's final 5 seconds in careful, deliberate detail. The lesson taught was not about violence, nor was it framed as a warning against humanity specifically. It was framed instead as a broader lesson about the dangers of underestimating any species based on incomplete information, about the importance of approaching every negotiation with genuine respect rather than assumed superiority, about the difference between strength that seeks domination and strength that simply refuses to be dominated. Doran Yell, promoted eventually to oversee that very training program, often concluded each session with the same simple observation. Voraz believed strength meant never showing restraint. He would tell each new class of officers. He was wrong. True strength is choosing restraint when you have every capability to do otherwise. Humanity showed us that distinction in 5 seconds. It took the rest of us considerably longer to understand it. Years later, when historians across a dozen species attempted to chart the moment humanity truly earned its place within the wider galactic community, they would inevitably return to that single negotiation chamber, to those 5 seconds broadcast live across 1,000 worlds, to the quiet, controlled response of a diplomat who had never wanted to prove anything to anyone, but who understood, without hesitation, exactly what needed to be done when peace was violated in front of an audience that size. Marcus Alaric eventually stepped back from active diplomatic service, choosing a quieter life much like the one he had built before humanity's first contact with the wider galaxy. He rarely spoke publicly about the incident that had defined so much of his legacy, preferring instead to let the passage of time and the steady growth of humanity's peaceful alliances speak for themselves. But whenever asked, by curious journalists, by young diplomats seeking guidance, by anyone genuinely wanting to understand what that moment had truly meant, he offered the same simple explanation, the one truth that seemed to capture everything the galaxy had learned from those 5 unforgettable seconds. "We never wanted to be feared," he would say. "We wanted to be understood. But if understanding requires demonstrating exactly where our patience ends, then we'll demonstrate it, once, clearly, and hope nobody ever makes us demonstrate it again." The galaxy, having watched that demonstration unfold in real time, rarely needed it repeated. Peace, once chosen, remained the far more common path between humanity and the countless species it eventually came to call allies. But every species that negotiated with Earth in the years that followed carried with them the quiet, unspoken understanding that this peace was never guaranteed by weakness, nor granted out of fear alone. It was a choice, made freely, by a species fully capable of choosing otherwise. And in a galaxy built for centuries around the assumption that only strength ruled the stars, that single distinction changed everything.